I am a Yank in Sussex. There are literally thousands of castles and other fortifications in the British Isles, from ancient Bronze and Iron Age hill forts to Roman castras, Saxon burghs, Norman motte-and-baileys, Elizabethan show palaces, and modern fortresses of steel and concrete. But high up on the South Downs escarpment near the little village of Edburton, accessible only by foot or by quadcopter, stands the remnant of a 1,000-year-old motte-and-bailey fortification built by the Normans under William the Conqueror in the early years of the conquest. There's not much there, and in the past it's been mistaken for a Bronze Age barrow by treasure hunters. But it's interesting evidence for the stamp that the Conqueror was placing on the land of Sussex, and by extension all of England. First, let's have a look at the village of Edburton at the foot of the escarpment, which is actually much older than the fort on the hill above. When the British bride first took me to visit the nearby attraction of Devil's Dyke, we drove through the little village of Edburton. British location names are a special point of interest to me, and my first thought was to wonder who Ed Burton was. Was he Richard Burton's brother? This seemed unlikely, since the village obviously predates that famous actor's film career, and even then, why would they name a place after his brother? As it turns out, even Richard Burton wasn't a Burton. His birth name was actually Richard Jenkins, Jr. Did he even have a brother named Ed? Who knows, and who cares? But I think I've pushed this little joke far enough as it is, so let's move on. Anyway, the source of Ed Burton's name is actually to be found in the Old English language. The name comes from Eadborg's Tun, meaning Eadborg's, I can't even say it right, Eadborg's settlement or town. Eadborg is a woman's name, and some believe that it refers to Edburga of Winchester, a granddaughter of King Alfred the Great and daughter of his successor, King Edward the Elder. Edburga was specifically dedicated to the service of God by her parents, and she spent her life as a nun, eventually being venerated as a saint. As for the traditions at Edburton village itself, the information sheet distributed at the church confirms the Edburg story, saying further that it was she who converted the pagan Saxons who dwelt at the location to Christianity, and it was she who built the church for them and lent her name to the settlement. The history of Christianity in England makes this story plausible, if not confirmable. Assuming this to be true, the village church was built at Edburga's direction around 940 CE, and as the daughter of a king, she would have had influence enough to get her father to finance the building of this church. It should be noted that the church at Edburton is rather large in comparison to the size of the modern village, which has only a few houses. It's certain that 1,000 years ago the village was much larger, since a church of this size would normally serve a substantially larger population. The existing church at Edburton, which by the way is dedicated to St. Andrew, isn't the original structure. That first church collapsed and was rebuilt in the late 12th century on the same foundations, recycling some of the same materials from the original building. Not all parts of the church date from the same period either. The upper wall and windows, for example, are late 12th and early 13th century, while other parts are from later times, up to the 17th century. The history of the church contains plenty of points of interest, which in the interest of time I won't be covering in this video, except for mention of George Keith, who served as the rector of St. Andrews from 1705 to 1716. Reverend Keith was a Scottish-born Presbyterian who converted to the Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers, immigrated to the American colonies during the late 1680s or early 1690s, and served as a leading minister of the Philadelphia Friends monthly meeting in Pennsylvania. But he didn't get along well with the colony's ruling Quakers. His criticisms led the Friends to become less friendly to him, and he was expelled from their society in 1693, whereupon he returned to England. Keith converted to Anglicanism in 1700 and then went back to North America as the first missionary for the missionary organization Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. Yes, that was its name, from 1702 to 1704. Incidentally, the society remains active to this day. Later, Reverend Keith returned to England and served out the remainder of his years as the rector of this church. This stained glass window here commemorates his service. As the interior of the church attests, it is still an active part of the community. As I mentioned in my video on Devil's Dyke, the northern edge of the South Downs chalk escarpment, along which Edburton lies, is called a spring line, meaning a line of freshwater springs that provides a year-round supply of clean spring water, something which percolates through the chalk layers of the downs from the frequent rain. And the ground north of the escarpment, part of the Sussex Weald, provides a range of soil types for farming. For over 1,000 years, farming has been the primary occupation of those living at Edburton. Now, my main interest for this video is not the village of Edburton itself, although it's important for its antiquity. The primary focus is the motte-and-bailey castle that was built high above Edburton, on the escarpment, on a prominence called Edburton Hill. The hill stands 471 feet above the village. One might come to wonder why this castle was built here, of all places. The key may be the circumstances that existed at the time of the Norman conquest. When William the Conqueror defeated Anglo-Saxon King Harold at Hastings in October 1066, one of his first tasks would have been to secure the county of Sussex, both as a base and a place at which reinforcement and resupply could be received from his homeland of Normandy. Normandy lay immediately opposite the coast of Sussex. Edburton lies along what would have been an important line of communication between eastern and western Sussex, guarding supply lines. It also lies along the boundary between the two rapes of Lewes and Bramber, which would have been administered by two of William the Conqueror's barons, and being in a position to support either. At least part of securing the Norman conquest would have involved making the Conqueror's power visible to everyone, and what better evidence of his power would there be than a strong wooden palisaded fortress standing high above the plain of the Sussex Weald for all to see. The consensus of the archaeologists who have studied this castle is that it was built in the period shortly after the Battle of Hastings, either just before or after William's coronation as King of England. In this view of Edburton Hill from just west of Edburton, you can see a bit of contour that suggests that there's something up there, but it isn't obvious these days what it might be. Knowing what's up there, we can identify part of the bailey wall, the bailey and the motte. A quick look from space using Google Earth shows the distinctive shape of a classic earthworks fortification of the motte-and-bailey type. This type was introduced to the British Isles by the Norman invaders beginning in 1066. The name refers to the two major portions of the structure, the motte, upon which the keep was erected, and the bailey, or outer courtyard. The motte is the inner defensive structure, where the occupants of the castle will retreat to if the bailey is breached. This is a tallish, cone-shaped earthwork that is surrounded by a ditch and a wall, and topped by a tower called a keep. The bailey would contain service buildings such as barracks, cookhouse, and storage spaces. Like the motte, the bailey is surrounded by a ditch and an earthen mound or berm, and the berm would be topped by a wooden wall or palisade. We see this structure very clearly in looking at a LiDAR image of the castle. Sometimes such a ditch is filled with water via a nearby river or lake, but that is relatively rare. And in the case of the Edburton Castle, there's no source of water to fill the ditch. These ditches perform their defensive function primarily by being deep enough to make it difficult for attackers to approach the wall and easy for the defenders to shoot arrows and other missiles at the attackers below. Of course, there needs to be a way to enter the castle, and there is always a break in the berm surrounding the bailey where there is either a causeway or a drawbridge. In the case of the Edburton Castle, however, there are actually two causeways, one to the east and the other to the west. If such a castle is occupied for an extended period, the wooden palisade on the berm is frequently replaced by stronger and more permanent stone or brick walls. This fortification on Edburton Hill, however, appears to have never been fitted with a stone wall. But since it has never been subjected to a detailed archaeological excavation or study, this isn't entirely certain. There are no stone remnants visible, however, so it's a good assumption that there was no such wall. It's believed that the castle was erected shortly after William the Conqueror invaded England, and shortly after he won the Battle of Hastings. It's unknown how long the castle was occupied, however. It's mentioned in the Domesday Book, which was completed in 1086, which is 20 years after the conquest, but there's no further mention of it in the available records. This strongly suggests that it was abandoned quite early. The erection of Lewes Castle in 1069 and of Bramber Castle in 1071 may have made this castle surplus to requirements, or in other words, redundant. What did the castle look like in its heyday? It's not hard to guess at, since there are plenty of motte-and-bailey remnants in the British Isles. Here's a couple which still retain their original shape to a large degree. These are Pleshey Castle in Essex and Sandal Castle in West Yorkshire. I wish I were more of an artist so I could recreate a plausible appearance for the castle at Edburton when it was active, but I'm not. Getting on the ground to examine the castle remnant requires either a long walk from Devil's Dyke, or a shorter but much steeper climb from the bottom of the escarpment, for which there are a number of alternative routes. My fellow YouTuber, Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer, has recorded his very own climb up to the castle and his examination of the features to be seen at ground level. A link to the video of his walk up the escarpment and to the castle can be found in the description. As for me, I was not quite of a mind to do either walk, and instead used my quadcopter to examine the castle from a field alongside the road opposite Paythorn Farm. On a late afternoon in 2018, I sent my drone up the 471 feet of the escarpment. I chose an afternoon when the sun was low in order to maximize shadow, the theory being that this would make the relief features of the castle more evident. Also, because on the day in question the winds, which are frequently excessive for a poor little drone, were reduced. As we come up to the level where you can see the structure of the castle, to get an idea of the size of it, keep in mind that all those white bits of fluff behind the castle are adult sheep. As we get to a good hover over it, you can see the motte, which is 30 meters or just under 100 feet in diameter. It stands 2 meters or 6.5 feet above the general ground level at its crest. That circular depression in the middle of it, it dates from the 1800s and was caused by treasure hunters who mistook this structure for a burial mound and dug into it looking for gold or other valuables. The motte is typical, being fully surrounded by a ditch. Surrounded by its own ditch, the bailey is easily twice the size of the motte, being about 65 meters or over 200 feet wide. To get a better idea of the scale here, the bailey is approximately as wide as a soccer pitch, or about 3/4 as wide as an American football field. If this structure had been just freshly dug, the ditches would be much deeper, and the berms surrounding the bailey and the motte itself would be much taller than they are now. Erosion has definitely taken its toll over the centuries. And now, have a look at the breathtaking view from the top of the escarpment over the Sussex Weald. As Mr. Douglas in the old American TV comedy Green Acres said, "Land spreading out so far and wide." I think my singing career is at an end. Anyway, so our visit to Edburton and its castle comes to an end. One of these days might see an actual archaeological investigation of the site, from which we'll learn much more about it, but for the moment this is as much as we can know. Until that day comes, the sheep will watch carefully over the site. This has been a production of A Yank in Sussex. If you've enjoyed the video, please click the like button. If you haven't already done so, feel free to click the subscribe button along with the notification bell in order to be notified when new videos are posted on the channel. May you have a very nice day.